Okay, so we're going to do the last lecture of the first unit, and we're going to talk about membranes. So in the last lecture, you learned about the cavities of the body, right? So the axial skeleton, the trunk of the body, really has several regions which are going to be open space where your organs live, right? The organs have to have somewhere to live, just like you have to have somewhere to live. And they stay inside these specific cavities. There's the thoracic cavity with the pleural cavity for the lungs, the pericardial cavity for the heart, and then we have the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, which is where your digestive and reproductive organs live. Well, these organs also have to be protected and separated from each other. They're not just hanging out in your cavities, not doing anything, right? They're doing their jobs and they move a lot. So, in order to protect them, they have membranes. So, we're going to talk about that now and how we name them. There are really two types of membranes when we're talking about membranes around organs. There's the visceral membrane and the parietal membrane. Now, the visceral membrane, the word viscera actually means organ, and that's what's actually on the organ itself. It covers the organ. And then the parietal membrane lines the cavity where the organ lives. So imagine you're sitting in your room right now, right? You are an organ. So let's say you're a heart. You would have the clothing that you're wearing would be like the visceral membrane, and then the walls have paint on them, right? The reason you paint your walls is to protect them. So the paint on your walls would be like the parietal membrane because that's the cavity where you're living. I'm going to show you an image that might make this a little easier to understand. So if you take a look here, what you'll see is this is the heart, right? So that would be your pericardial cavity. And what ends up happening is it's actually a double layered membrane which surrounds the organ. The same thing's true for the lungs and the other organs. So imagine taking your fist and punching it into a deflated water balloon. What would happen is that water balloon would wrap itself around your fist, just like you see here. Well, that's essentially what you see happening here with the heart, right? And what you end up with is a double layered membrane. So the outer layer, this outer layer here, would be the parietal membrane that's on the wall of the cavity, because this is the cavity where that heart lives. And then this inner portion of that membrane is the visceral. And then in this space right here, that is where we're going to have a fluid, which I'm going to talk about now. So that double layered membrane does have a fluid, just like a water balloon has fluid in it, called serous fluid. Now, what serous fluid is, it's mostly water, but it has some proteins in there, and it acts like oil in your car. So you guys are all probably just starting to drive your cars and get a car. And one of the things you have to do is you have to get your oil changed, because as your car gets used, it's a lot of moving mechanical parts, right? And friction's going to occur. And if you don't change the oil and the oil dries up, the engine's going to seize up and just lock up and stop working. Well, think about your heart. It beats 60 to 80 times a minute, every minute of your life. Hopefully you live a nice long life. The heart doesn't beat quietly. It's actually a violent action. It has a double pump, and it's like jumping around in your chest. And every time the heart beats, it's going to be rubbing up against the membrane and rubbing up against other organs. So what this fluid does is it actually acts as a shock absorber, and it reduces friction between the layers. So if inflammation occurs, like people have issues with that, and that does happen. But if you have serous fluid in there, it should prevent that. Let's talk a little bit now about how we name these membranes, because this is the tricky part of this section. You're going to name them based on the cavity that they're in, and if it's on the actual organ or if it's on the wall of the organ. So, for example, if I'm talking about the lungs, right? The lungs are in the pleural cavity or the pleura cavity, right? If I want to know about the membrane on the lungs, it would be the visceral pleura, because it's the membrane that's on the lung, not on the walls. So that's visceral. And then the second word is pleura, and that tells you it's the lungs. So if I were to ask you, what's the name of the membrane on the lungs? The answer would be visceral pleura. The next example would be parietal. So that would be on the walls. And peritoneum I haven't mentioned yet. So that's going to be on the next slide. So let's go over that. So there's three cavities you need to be aware of. The first one is the pleural cavity. And there's two options for naming the membranes in the pleural cavity. So this is going to be your lungs. And that was the example I gave on the slide before this. The visceral pleura, oh, I spelled plural wrong. Sorry, that A should not be there. The visceral pleura would be the actual membrane on the lungs itself. And then the parietal pleura would be the membrane on the walls of the cavity where the lungs live. So again, if you're a lung and you're sitting in your room right now and your room is the cavity, Your clothing would be the visceral pleura because it's on you, and then the covering on the wall, which is protecting the wall, would be the parietal pleura because that's the name of that cavity. The second cavity is the pericardial cavity. So it's the same rules. If I were to ask you what is the name of the membrane on the heart, it would be the visceral pericardium. And then if I were to say what is the name of the membrane on the walls of the cavity where the heart is found, it would be the parietal pericardium. Now, this is a very commonly affected membrane because the heart beats so much, and they gave it a little nickname. So you do need to be aware of that. The visceral pericardium is also known as the epicardium for short. So you could say visceral pericardium or you could say epicardium. A lot of times people have issues with that membrane and inflammation because of friction. And, if they don't have enough serous fluid or they have issues, it can cause some problems. The last one, this is the confusing one. So let me just take a moment to go over that. The abdominal cavity has one membrane which wraps around all of the organs in there, and it's called the peritoneum. Okay, so what the heck am I talking about? Imagine you're about to go on a big trip. Imagine you're moving, and your parents are like, you need to help us move. Go take our really expensive glasses and wrap them up so they don't break. And they give you a big flat piece of bubble wrap. So in your head, imagine a big flat piece of bubble wrap and then a whole bunch of glasses. How can you wrap them up so you protect them? Well, what you can do is you could take one glass, wrap it up a little bit, and then you can throw another glass next to it and wrap it up even more, and then throw another glass in and keep wrapping it up. So at the end, you're going to get this big bundle of bubble wrap with a bunch of glasses embedded in there so they don't break. Well, that's essentially what's going on here with the peritoneum. The abdominal cavity is jam-packed with organs. We have it's where most of our organs in our body are. They're in that abdominal cavity. And when we do a dissection at the end of the year, you're going to see they are jammed in there. There's not a lot of space, and they're all doing their thing. And one of the important things is they have to stay in their place. You don't want your stomach shifting its position and getting stuck behind your spleen, right? That would be terrible. So one of the ways that nature deals with this is all of your abdominal organs are wrapped in the same membrane and it holds them in place. And that is called the peritoneum. So any organ that exists in your abdominal cavity is either going to be the visceral peritoneum or the parietal peritoneum. So, for example, if I were to ask you, what is the name of the membrane on your kidneys? It would be visceral peritoneum. If I were to say, what is the name of the membrane on your spleen? It would be visceral peritoneum. So they're all visceral peritoneum. If I say, what is the name of the membrane on the walls of the cavity where your stomach is? It would be parietal peritoneum. So the way you do this, the way you name these membranes is simply you take the name of what the type of membrane. Is it the visceral membrane on the organ? Or is it the parietal membrane on the walls of the cavity? And then you're going to add the name of the cavity itself after that. So if it's the heart, it's the pericardial cavity. If it's the lungs, it's the pleural cavity. And if it's the abdominal organs, it would be the peritoneal cavity. And I believe that is it.